From its metal soundtrack and all-caps title, to its low-poly art style, to its gory action horror vibe, DUSK sets out to recapture the aesthetic and design sensibilities of mid to late 90s first-person action games. DUSK is a love letter to id's Doom and Quake, 3D Realms' Duke Nukem 3D, Raven's Hexen and Heretic, Valve's Half-Life, and above all, Monolith's Blood. And trying to recapture that era of shooters is actually kind of a fascinating proposition. In a way, it's almost an inversion of the challenges faced by Doom 2016. That game had to figure out how to take a first-person action game from 1992 and remake it as a modern AAA title that could be sold as a big-budget multi-platform release. It had to ask themselves how much of the game's playstyle is core to the identity of the franchise, and how much needed to be gutted and updated to be palatable to a modern audience. In contrast, DUSK is aiming to recreate the very design sensibilities and visual style that Doom 2016 set about reinventing. It isn't trying to carry an intellectual property forward into the present, but instead argue that the elements that Doom 2016 spent a lot of time and effort eliminating or reinventing are still relevant and worthwhile even today. Does it succeed? I think it largely does, yeah. And talking about how is kind of dry and mechanical, but I find it fascinating. For example, one of the most difficult things that any retro shooter is going to run into is capturing the sense of game feel that those old shooters had. It might seem superficial, but it's actually critical. First, because DUSK is trying to compare itself to some of the best shooters of all time that helped define what good game feel in this genre even was, so it kinda has to nail that. And second, because when you're building a game with very simple mechanics, those mechanics have to be satisfying to perform. DUSK is definitely not about narrative or even content so much as the simplicity of one-man versus the world action via bare-bones combat mechanics, and if those mechanics feel like a mushy, muddled mess, the whole thing falls apart. This game, like all 90s shooters, largely lives or dies on its level design and immediate short-term gameplay loops. Luckily on that front, DUSK fares pretty well. It isn't perfect, but it's better than pretty much all the other games that have attempted to do the retro shooter thing, especially with this particular set of influences. For example, movement speed is appropriately fast. Not Doom, you run as fast as your rocket's fast, but way quicker than most modern shooter titles and even some of the games it's using as inspiration. Between the speed, verticality, and mouse input, level navigation feels very Quakey overall more than doomy or bloody, though there's a flashlight and a crouch slide and a general emphasis on exploring things while crouched that gives the controls a slight Half-Life feel as well. Enemy fire is either melee or projectile-based, as you'd hope for a game like this, capturing that Robotron-like gameplay of firing at enemies while weaving between their bullets and kiting swarms of chainsaw-wielding AI units behind you. And by mixing projectile types and speeds, the game makes circle strafing more than just a one-note activity. It's not just hold strafe left or right and shoot at the enemies in the center of the circle, but zigging and zagging while trying to keep the herds of monsters where you want them. And most weapons have a satisfying heft to them, especially the shotguns, which largely seem modeled after Doom's. That said, some weapons do fare better than others. The mortar, for example, launches balls that both fall too slowly and launch with too slow of a velocity. Comparing the slow, floaty balls in DUSK to the Quake grenade launcher, there really isn't much of a comparison. One feels fast and lethal, and the other feels like you're limply lobbing water balloons in slow motion. DUSK has a reason for this. You have the ability to detonate the grenades on command, and slowing them down makes it easier to time the perfect point at which to do that. So it's not a nonsensical approach to this weapon, but it's a bit of a step away from the brutal, fast, simplistic mechanics the game otherwise employs. Really, if there's any break DUSK takes from this era of shooter design, it is in the weapons. The games of the mid-90s tended to be wildly more experimental in their weapon design than DUSK is willing to be. There was an emphasis on maximalism, movie references, and wacky mechanics that DUSK more or less ignores. Duke Nukem 3D had a shrink ray and a freeze beam. Doom had its plasma gun and BFG that not only exploded but damaged anyone that had line of sight to the explosion. Blood had voodoo dolls and Tesla cannons. Blood 2 had phantasm balls. Unreal had that bio-rifle that let you cover enemies in goo or build various sized mines by pooling the stuff. Half-Life had glue-on guns and Gauss cannons for the big science weapons, and alien snarks that you could drop down to swarm at enemies that are driven by AI. There was a playfulness in trying to find mechanics that weren't just aim at target and make them explode, as well as a desire to say, well, if you are just going to aim at the target and make them explode, let's really make them explode. Dusk doesn't really set its sights on anything quite as powerful feeling or as goofy. Aside from the remote detonating grenades, Dusk has a crossbow that can shoot through multiple enemies and level geometry, and that's about as experimental as it gets. Otherwise, it's pretty standard stuff. The most powerful weapon in Dusk is a rivet gun whose projectiles explode on impact, effectively making it a high-speed rocket launcher. It's a library of tools that is satisfying but pretty standard fare, which I do think for a game aimed at emulating this era of shooters should have toyed with more. But all that said, those are nitpicks. The game feel is fine. It's got more high points than low points, and for a game trying to capture the sense of playing a game from 1996 to 1999, it manages to present a reasonable argument as to why those shooters were so engrossing. That sense of being able to dive into a room of 5, 10, or 20 enemies and improvise a plan on the fly is very much present here in a way it just isn't in modern games. And that's the conceit, at least in the moment-to-moment gameplay, that makes Dusk work, the core argument that keeps this style of gameplay feeling relevant in 2018. Again, Doom 2016 mostly just removed the thinking on your feet strategy part and focused on pure adrenaline, which was cool, but was just pure adrenaline, while other games tend to focus on formal cover systems and minimizing damage from enemies' hit-scan weapons rather than dodging fire in general. Even Destiny, which is arguably the closest modern counterpart to this in a lot of ways, is more about aiming at the critical hit spots on enemies down iron sights than crowd control and inventive weapon selection. Dusk isn't about ripping and tearing your way through arena battles, and it's not stop-and-pop high lethality. It's about being able to use the variety of tools at your disposal, weapons, cover, exploding barrels, enemy infighting, whatever, to dispatch enemies by juggling aggro while avoiding their projectiles. It's an improvisational dance where you lead and the enemies follow, and the better you are at the game, the more graceful it all feels. And that's really cool. I missed that. Now, if all Dusk did was capture the combat loops of mid-90s shooters, that might be enough for hardcore fans of the era like me, who grew up with that stuff, but I don't know if that alone would result in something that would resonate in 2018. What really makes Dusk shine, though, is its level design. For one thing, encounter design, generally speaking, harkens back to a period-appropriate attempt to mix things up. This was one of my big complaints with Doom 2016. All weapons were considered equally valid, and because arena fights are a fracas, they all tended to just blur together. Keep moving, keep shooting, rip and tear, rip and tear. That is not the case here. Enemy selection and ammo availability drive a lot of how you find yourself playing the game. While it never feels quite as experimental to me as Doom or Quake did in terms of mixing and matching ammo types and monsters, there were definitely scenarios where I found myself picking off some high-strength targets from afar with the hunting rifle, or being trapped in a castle with just a sword and being told to stealthily take out guys from behind, or dropping mortars into crowds of cultists that had gathered together, or saving high-powered rivet gun ammo for a stronger enemy I knew was about to come through the gate, or using the fact that the bow and arrow could shoot through geometry and multiple monsters to either conserve ammo or attack unseen. And it's not just mixing ammo and enemy types, the game keeps its encounters varied in terms of scope. There are claustrophobic brawls in cramped hallways, and there are times where you're dodging fire from half a level away in an open field while taking pot shots at enemies with pistols. Dusk ends up feeling really well paced by regularly refreshing what kinds of challenges you're exploring. It doesn't linger on any one gameplay gimmick or enemy or weapon combination for too long. It helps that it also knows how to design keycard-gated levels in a way that is, most of the time anyways, not obnoxious.
Take care.
It uses its colored keycard design not to force players on scavenger hunts, but to guide them from one area to the next in a controlled manner while giving the players clear markers of progress. It's still kind of a tedious mechanic in 2018, but keeping levels small enough to comb through, ensuring that keys are visibly marked, and presenting you with cool-looking doors in areas that you can't get to up front at the beginning of the level to help motivate you to find the keys, all help make the approach feel less like a chore and more like a pacing tool. So yeah, Dusk manages to capture not just the combat loops, but the general level structure of old games, and that's kinda cool. But to me, Dusk's real achievement in level design is its ability to capture a sense of playfulness, an eagerness to explore the boundaries of what it can do with these 3D spaces. For example, you'll traverse simple representations of suburban mundanity from nonsensical angles as gravity shifts and twists every time you activate a glowing orb. A laboratory you're in begins to fold in on itself in impossible ways. You climb down, down, down into the depths of hell under the city of Dusk, only to arrive at a power plant underneath a massive city that launches you into a church in the clouds. You walk through a door only to emerge out of a crack in the wall only a few inches tall, like something out of Alice in Wonderland. And I think this anchors the game to a specific era of level design. In early id games, you had levels that were collages of ideas and iconography that conveyed a tone more than a literal space that had utility unto itself. Doom's cybertronic labs and decimated cities being overtaken with brimstone and hellborn biomass, or Quake's techno-industrial facilities giving way to obsidian monoliths and corrupted altars to fallen gods. They conveyed an abstract emotion, but were not meant to necessarily be representational. E1M1 in Quake is not meant to represent a literal, functional military base, but instead it's a playground for gameplay that confers the lonely, dreary mood, as well as the boxy mechanical industrial geometry being severed with a river and a cave system suggesting it's intruding where it shouldn't be. It's all emotion and no logic. The flip side of this design ideology was what developers using the build engine were doing. Despite being a far more limited toolset, 3D Realms and Monolith were interested in exploring mundane locations with an action movie bravado. Duke Nukem 3D had incredibly representational locations.
Damn, I'm looking good.
A seedy movie theater in LA, a theme park, a movie studio, a fast food establishment. Blood similarly had train tracks and graveyards and icebergs with boats and cityscapes. Verisimilitude was more important than the level design here. Where Quake and Doom wanted gameplay first, tone second, and narrative not really at all, the build games were largely about representational levels that felt like real places first, and modified to support gameplay second. But by aiming for actual spaces, the levels themselves didn't confer a feeling even if they did confer a lived-in sense of reality. It's all logic and no emotion. By the time Half-Life and Sin came on the scene in 1998, the abstract spaces had more or less entirely fallen away. You could see an occasional experimental shooter with them, and arguably games like Unreal Tournament and Quake 3 that focused on pure combat and had big mapping communities kept experimentation alive for a while, but that sense of adventure in level design and conferring emotion through architecture had largely fallen off for shooters. Representational levels were increasingly the rule of the land, even if they had to bend that representationality to facilitate gameplay. But what Dusk does is it splits the difference between the two, and in so doing its levels feel like they are straight out of that time period between 1992 and 1998, a time where we were still building towards levels that felt like lived in realistic spaces, but also engaged with experimental level design because we could. Because it was a new medium and we didn't know what to do with it yet, because who's to say video games had to be literal or representational, because why shouldn't you be able to hit a button and change gravity or have a world that warps in on itself? Why not? Because it's cool. So it's not just that the game plays like a shooter from the 90s in terms of minute-to-minute combat loop, and it's not just that it has level design that uses keycards, it manages to encapsulate the level design and sensibilities of the era themselves. An experimental sense of wonder about the idea of creating a space that you get to walk through that could be anything. But the other benefit of this approach to level design is that it manages to confer a dreamlike, or maybe nightmare-like, quality to the proceedings. Dusk leans way harder into its horror elements than Doom or even Blood did, with several outright scary mechanics. The Wendigo enemies are invisible until you damage them, leaving only blood prints in the ground to help you find them, and one unveiled come with a screeching audio cue. At one point you're even trapped in a dark room with one without a flashlight. Then there are the scarecrow enemies, some of which come to life and some are just scarecrows. And amidst all this horror iconography, Dusk contrasts the grounded and absurd to present surreal nightmares. Rooms and architecture will occasionally repeat, but not in a prefabricated way. The game comments on it, calls attention to it, it calls into question the nature of spaces around you, and it calls into question the nature of the reality you find yourself in. It plays with small-town, rural, and industrial iconography that all hide labyrinthian catacombs, machines that run on meat, and sacrificial chambers to evil gods. It swings back and forth between all emotion and all logic from level to level and sometimes room to room, weaving together scenes that are very representational and scenes that are pure abstract geometry in a way that feels piped from your subconscious. And all that dreamlike quality gives the game an undercurrent of existential dread that I just can't shake. It may be because I watched 4 Phantasm movies over the holiday break due to the last drive-in, or it may be because Blood 2 also had more than a passing interest in the Phantasm series, but it does remind me of that series' pliable reality and dreamy continuity in service to horror and action. Don't get me wrong, Dusk is not a horror game proper, and it's still got that 90s sense of snarky irreverence at its core. This is a game where one of the bosses is a bile-spewing alligator called Intoxigator, and another is a terrible 90s-era Arnold Schwarzenegger impression.
Come on, kill me! Come on! Come on!
But despite being a pastiche of other games and other games' references, this horror-focused nightmare dream cycle gives the game something of its own identity at the last minute, and prevents the affair from becoming little more than a retread of well-worn mechanics. Anyways, does Dusk successfully make a case for older mechanics? Yeah, I think it does. And it's not alone, either. From Sonic Mania to Mega Man 9, 10, and 11 to Iron Maiden to Overload, we're rediscovering value in the games and genres that we thought we had to reinvent and instead are making them new again. They may have faded for a reason. They might not support modern design sensibilities or attract audiences big enough to support a major release, or maybe they just slowly had their edges sanded away until they became something else entirely. But just because something is no longer trendy, hip, or manufactured at mass scale doesn't mean it no longer has value. There's a difference between moving on from the past and utterly discarding it, and Dusk makes a strong case that the old ways, when approached with care, can still bear fruit.